All right, hopefully you got a little bit of a brain break and you're ready to move on. So we still have 2 bubbles left on your cellular respiration bubble graphic organizer here. So let's fill those out. So what happens when you don't have oxygen or you don't quite have enough oxygen? So oxygen is super important because it comes in at the end of the electron transport chain, right? And it accepts all of those electrons that were used to make the energy. So without oxygen, the electron carriers can't pass on their electrons and the chain gets backed up basically. So the whole electron transport chain stops, the Krebs cycle stops, and then those electron carrier molecules, the NAD and the FAD, they can't be recycled, which kind of, throws a wrench into everything because glycolysis can't keep going if their electron carriers aren't there to pick up those electrons and capture that energy. So what happens is that your body or the organism this is happening in will switch over from aerobic respiration to a different type of, I wouldn't call it respiration, but a different way to break down this energy. So the electrons that are coming from glycolysis, when the glucose is breaking down, they're going to get put back onto pyruvate. So these electron carrier molecules that get all full and they can't go anywhere because the electron transport chain's all backed up, they're just going to stick those electrons back onto pyruvate for now, and this process called fermentation starts. So here's a little copy of what's going on. So here's our electron carrier molecule NAD. Once it gets its electrons, it goes to NADH, which normally goes to the electron transport chain, and the electrons go to oxygen. But no oxygen coming in, we can't do that step, and we can't do that step. So we're stuck with NADH, so it's got to get recycled a different way. So fermentation is a word for the process that happens when there's no oxygen or not enough oxygen in your cells. So the process of fermentation is going to recycle those electron carriers because they're going to just stick those electrons onto pyruvate. And that pyruvate with those electrons are going to get turned into something else. So it could go either 2 ways depending on what kind of organism you are. So if you're a yeast or a certain type of microorganism that has the right enzymes, you're going to do alcoholic fermentation. This turns that pyruvate into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and it recycles your electron carriers. Yay! So now glycolysis can keep going. So alcoholic fermentation is how we get our alcoholic beverages, and it's also how our bread rises. So when we put yeast in bread dough, the yeast starts to break down the sugars. It's stuck in the dough. It doesn't have any oxygen. So it's going to start doing this and creating CO2, which is what makes our bread rise. Now, if you are a human or most other organisms besides the yeast, you're going to do lactic acid fermentation instead. So the pyruvate is going to turn into lactic acid, and those electron carrier molecules get recycled. Yay, glycolysis can keep going. So lactic acid fermentation gives us things like pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi, cheese, yogurt, and sour cream. Unfortunately, in our bodies, it just gives us burning muscles. So like when you're exercising way too hard and you feel the burn, that's the lactic acid. So unfortunately, it's not super helpful for us, but it does help us keep glycolysis going if we don't have enough oxygen in our muscles. So say you're starting to go for a run. Maybe there's a muskox chasing you or something, I don't know. So you start running really fast. Now, there's 3 ways you can get ATP, which is going to keep your muscle cells going. So there's a little bit of stored ATP always in your cells, just a little bit of backup, but that's only going to last you for a few seconds if you're really pushing yourself hard. Now, if you keep going, ATP from respiration is going to start kicking in, but unfortunately, this is a pretty slow process. It takes a lot to go through the Krebs cycle, through the electron transport chain. You know, the mitochondria does a good job, but it's not super fast. So if you're really sprinting, this isn't going to be good enough. So you're going to get some built-up electron carriers that are all full, some built-up pyruvate. Your body's going to switch to fermentation and start making lactic acid. So this is going to go really fast, and glycolysis goes really fast. So that little cycle of glycolysis and fermentation can keep going and give you ATP really fast. And that's going to keep you going for about 90 seconds. So a minute and a half to 3 minutes maybe. But unfortunately at that point you're going to have so much lactic acid built up in your muscles that your cells get too acidic and they've got to shut down that process. So, you know, this will keep you alive if you're running from something. So it's a good thing. But after that point, you've got to start slowing down. So even the best runners, they can't keep going strong sprinting forever. You know, after a couple minutes, they got to slow down and pace themselves. So we're done with that, done with that. The rest of the time, you're going to have to just wait for the ATP from respiration. So that'll keep you going for a really long time. But you got to pace yourself because it's not a super fast process. All right, so I've got a different page here to just review what's going on in your body. So when you need energy, you're going to break down your food. So we start with glucose. And once you use up like all the stored glucose in your cells, your body will start burning things like fats too. But this glucose in our first step or whatever we're using is going to get broken down into pyruvate. So remember, this is going to give us 2 ATP, and it happens super fast. Yay! This part's easy. You're just breaking that apart, making some ATP, charging up some electron carrier molecules. Life's good. All right. So once you've got your pyruvate, if you've got enough oxygen, we're going to go over here to the aerobic pathway, and you're going to use the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain in your mitochondria and use up that oxygen, dump your electrons on it at the end there, turn it into water. But if you don't have enough oxygen, because you're going way too fast or something, or something's not letting you breathe hard enough, you're going to go to this pathway. So you're going to switch into fermentation and turn that pyruvate into lactic acid. This process unfortunately doesn't give you any more ATP, but it does recycle those electron carrier molecules so that glycolysis can keep going and keep pumping out some ATP. All right, so your next assignment after you've turned in your cellular respiration bubble sheet is called cyanide murders. So you're going to be a detective and basically take a look at some murders that happened, true story, in Chicago a while back, where the victims died from not enough oxygen. We're going to take a look at it. So make sure you've got your notes ready and take a little brain break if you need to, and then head on to your next assignment.